Hello, my name is Rahimeh Ramazani. Welcome to this Vodcast conversation with the amazing Michael Reid. Thank you all so much for being here. Let me introduce Michael very, very quickly before we get started talking about all things diversity, equity, and inclusion, international DEI, English privilege. How does all this play out with cultural competencies and all the great things? Michael Reid is a linguistic and cultural equity consultant with more than 24 years of experience and is living in Athens, Greece with his family. He leads workshops and consultations for a broad variety of groups and stakeholders on diversity, cross-cultural communication, linguistic equality, and racial issues, and has chaired and sat on the board of multiple organizations working for diversity and inclusion. He has working proficiency in 6 languages, specifically English, Greek, Japanese, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Was born in the United States and has studied there as well as in France and Japan. Michael is passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice, being centered on and informed by the histories, cultures, and languages of the communities we work with and in. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me. It is absolutely my pleasure and privilege to be here talking about this. I'm one of those people who doesn't ever shy away from a chance to talk about the things I'm passionate about. So I really appreciate you.
I cannot relate to that at all. I have no idea what that must be like.
Well, let me explain. You see?
Yeah.
No, I really, really appreciate it, truly.
I'm so glad. And anyone listening, if you have not come across Michael on LinkedIn, that's where we met. Because I'm in California in the United States. Michael is in Greece. We're like on opposite sides of the planet, which is something that I appreciate so much about the age of the internet that we're in. There are pros and cons to all things, and the internet definitely has its cons for sure. And also the amount of rapport and like connection that you can build with people across the world, even people maybe in the next building from you, even physically, but you just don't happen to ever bump into each other. You don't happen to, I don't know, pass that like weird awkwardness acquaintance stage and realize that you have so much in common or your interests or your passions and so on. So I am so, so grateful that, Michael and I have been able to have the relationship we've had through LinkedIn and I've learned so much from you, Michael. Thank you again for being here. So with that, let's get into our first question to set us up for this conversation. What is English language privilege, and how have you seen it impact non-native English speakers while working for a United States-based company?
So English language privilege, and I'm going to step back from this for just a second and we need to understand that language privilege as a thing, as a general thing, it could apply to any language depending on the historical, societal, cultural context that we're talking about, right? Back in the day, it might have been, and especially in the former African colonies in France, it would have been French, right? Back in the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century, if we're talking about the sciences, maybe it would be German, something like that. Go even further back to the area I live in, and it would have been Greek, or the form of Greek that was spoken back then. So there's nothing intrinsic about English that accords it the status that it has today, or that that helps it accrue the privilege that it does today. So linguistic privilege just sort of writ large, and now sort of zeroing in on English-related linguistic privilege is, I think maybe the easiest way to describe it is to describe how it manifests. It's English being seen as a necessity, as a necessary condition for social mobility, for economic mobility. It is having your needs and occasionally just even your desires catered to in your language without really having to do anything extra. It's about having to do less work to get the same results than other people. I often think of what there's that quote about Ginger Rogers, talking about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. And they say, Fred Astaire was such a wonderful dancer. His partner, Ginger Rogers, what did she do? Everything he did, but backwards and in heels. Same thing in a lot of international companies that have English as their main operating language, but have a significant number of non-L1 English speakers. They're doing everything native English speakers are doing in a different language, right? A native English speaker just has to be an excellent scientist, an excellent engineer, an excellent coder, whatever, right? A non-native English speaker has to be just as excellent in a different language. So that's what we're talking about when we talk, at least, specifically about English. But if the situation were different, if we were living in a different timeline, we would replace English probably with a different language. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about that. So it's a similar system of privilege as operates in the gender sphere, as operates in the racial and ethnic sphere, as it operates in the religious sphere, all of these things, right? It is about the power that society accords to a certain set of traits or behaviors or skills or a background or whatever that keep you from having to encounter some of the barriers that other people have to encounter. So that those are just some ways that linguistic privilege manifests itself. And it's really important to remember that this is all going on against the context of English being a minority language in the world. Only about 17 to 20%, depending on how you cut the statistics. Only about 17 to 20% of the world speaks English at all. I mean, we're talking from functional to L1 speaker, right?
Wow.
So,
my God. That's so humbling. Necessary humbling.
Right? So fully 80 to 83% of the world does not have any functional competence in English at all. And yet a system of socioeconomic and cultural and political forces have gone into elevating English into kind of artificially elevating English into the status that it has. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about linguistic privilege, is these barriers to mobility, these barriers to entry, these barriers to success that are put up in front of people that don't have functional competency in English, even though that bears not at all on their skill, their intelligence, their general competence.
And this isn't even touching on the aspect of like accent, right? That you're speaking. Okay, go. Of course I said that right as you're taking a drink of water. Like this isn't even like, and you could be like fluent in English, but you have an accent, and that's not even, what do you want to say on that?
Absolutely. It is, and of course there are multiple ways, there are multiple intersections of this aspect of linguistic privilege, or in this case, linguistic marginalization, that interact with national origin. Obviously, it's about national origin, but it's also about socioeconomic class. It's also about race. It's also about ethnicity, right? Because, for example, and let's keep it to English, although I have seen it happen in other languages as well. But let's keep it to English for a second. If you have somebody, and I'm drawing examples from clients that I've worked with, you have a group of people, and you've got somebody, you've got a group of essentially native English speakers, and then you have maybe a few who have a noticeably different accent than the majority, say USians, so they're from Britain or Australia or something like that. Then you've got some people who have a non-native but not as stigmatized accent, right? Maybe from Germany or from France or something like that. Now, as you get down to that level, you will have people starting to assume maybe things about their competence or things like that, but oftentimes on a lighter level. What you really start to notice, and this, depends on the context in which you're in. If you're in the UK, for example, it might be somebody, if they have a Polish or a Romanian accent. If you're in the US, it might be somebody who has a Mexican or Puerto Rican accent, right? You start saying, you start evaluating them even lower on their competence then, or on their skills, or on their intelligence, or how they present themselves, even though, as you said, they may be speaking completely fluent English. They're just speaking it in a non-native way. And if the non-native way in which they speak, because of your cultural context, codes as being of a lower status, then you start sort of projecting all of that onto them. And then there are studies that back this up too.
For sure.
The same, you can have two people saying the exact same thing, word for word the same thing, and the accent in which they say it will skew the perception of what was being said. If I'm remembering correctly, and I need to look this up because I don't want to be just saying things that I half remember, but I do seem to remember something. Study came out back, I think it was sometime in the 2010s, talking about this study where they had the same utterance spoken by two people. One was, and I think they showed the people, but I don't remember. We'll say they didn't, though. And one just said the sentence in a fairly neutral, general West Coast U.S. accent. The other person said the exact same thing in a noticeably Arabic accent. And the person who spoke in the Arabic accent, what they said was judged to be harsher or more aggressive or, whatever. Same thing.
I'm
word
shocked.
for
Shocked.
word. Yeah, I know.
Who could have seen that happen?
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
Aggressive? Harsh? Sorry,
Right?
keep going.
No. Yeah, believe me. But so you've got situations like that, right? And again, I need to go back and find that study so I remember all the details of it and the methodology and everything. But the point is that obviously, and this is not just something that English speakers do, by the way. I'm not coming in hard for English speakers and just only picking on them because this happens in other languages. But there is ample research to show that we perceive the intentions, the abilities, the intelligence, all of these internal qualities about people differently depending on the accent that they speak in.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, absolutely. And honestly, like, just as an aside, this is just a little pet peeve that I have. Well, I do understand it. Just the idea of having to have like rigorous academic peer review studies to prove something that if you've been out and about in the world, like, it's just, yeah, of course. Yeah, duh, I know that.
Yeah, right.
Like, we can't like say is for sure a thing until someone has like done this rigorous Western academic style scientific study to then document, oh yeah, this is a thing. Like anyone, so for myself, I have a white mixed European American mother, and my father is an Iranian immigrant. And it's actually funny because I don't hear my dad speak with an accent. I've never been able to hear his accent. And yet anyone else I ask, including my mom, friends that have met my dad himself knows he speaks with an accent, which is, anyway, that's just funny to me that I literally cannot hear it. But he has said, and I know so many other people have shared, in grad school, I had folks who were part of my cohort who spoke with accents, coworkers, again, just people, like, again, you just are out and about in the world, and have any level of empathy and any level of safety for people to express their difficult experiences in your presence, not even to you necessarily. Is very much an understanding of how folks with accents who are non-native English speakers experience the world in dominant English speaking spaces. And again, they could have doctorates, they can have level of education and skills. And I don't want to overly push like academic skills or accreditations as like the only form of intelligence. So I don't say a doctorate to say that, people without doctorates are not highly educated or smart. Not at all. However, this, what would be considered an objective standard of intelligence, very highly so, is still considered subpar and like questioned, and they're constantly undermined in the workplace when they are hired and so on. It's like, this is just like, anyway, that's just a whole other like pet peeve that I have about like, we have to study it in this specific way and prove it in this specific way, with like anyone who's literally lived in the world at all knows that this is a thing.
Right. No, you're so right. And I do not blame you at all for that pet peeve. It's one of those things. And sometimes when I'm, occasionally when I'm feeling a little bit saltier than usual, and you see me get that way on LinkedIn,
I love it.
I feel like saying, and I've come very close to saying it, essentially, thank you for finally believing what I've been telling you about as a product of my lived experience for weeks, months, years.
Thanks for
right?
gaslighting me all these years. And
Right?
it's, and again, it's not even just one person. It's like thousands, millions. I don't even like whole communities, giant groups of people saying this is their experience.
Yep.
And you're just like, no, I literally will not believe it until, and that's the whole, I have a master's, so I have like a little bit of understanding of how academic, research a little bit goes into. Like, you have to get the funding, you have to get a grant, you have to have like a professor who is a PhD vouches for you and works with you, and then you have to do this, and then you have to get it peer reviewed, and then it takes years, and then editing and blah blah blah. Like, just all of that process that goes into like, again, okay, we believe that people with accents are treated with bias. Oh, wow, thank you so much. Anyway, so that's a whole other thing. That, I'm sorry, I go off on tangents all the time. It's an ADHD thing. I appreciate it. I embrace it now, and I have self-compassion for myself. But thank you for your flexibility and just, the whole accent thing. And I appreciate what you were saying. I promise this will be my last point on this end, and I'll get us back to my questions that I set up for us. But the idea, like, I love that you're pointing out about the distinction between, in the study that you're referencing, that it makes a huge difference of whether they showed the face of the person speaking or they didn't, because again, just as accent is just a verbal marker of what people with their biases and stereotypes key for code as, okay, this is intelligence, this is not intelligence, this is whatever, like whatever stereotypes or biases they might have about different countries, right? Like for me, off the top of my head, you mentioned German. For me, when I think of German people, Germany, a country, I think of like engineering and technology and like really highly innovative. So I could very much imagine that if I didn't have that self-awareness of, oh, I know that this is the like messaging that I have been continuously fed about Germany, and then I associate that with German people, that I might assume unknowingly, without checking myself, that this is how someone with a German accent might be, purely just because of that association and so on, right?
Exactly.
But the idea, then you add on, like, what is the color of that person's skin? What is their hair texture? What are their facial features like? How, Eurocentric are their facial features, even aside from like the color of their skin, and then you pull in. Also, we haven't mentioned like your name, right? Do you have an anglicized name? I know, like,
oh yes.
Do you have an anglicized name? Which, if you're in the workplace, you can't separate out like someone's accent. They're like, you're going to see their name in the emails. You're going to know the person you're talking to, like their name. You're going to know if they have a non-anglicized name. All of this thing pulls out, and that's the whole point of intersectionality, is that you can't, like, we're not just the sum of our parts. We can't just put like name plus accent plus how proficient we are in English plus X, Y, and Z equals what people think of us, right? It's all a mix constantly, and everyone is going to be different based off of their own individual systemic biases
100%.
About people.
100%. And we forget, I think, maybe it's because those of us who are sighted tend to put a lot of our focus into the visual information that we get. We forget that we react to auditory cues just as strongly, sometimes more strongly, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, to your point, it's not just what does the person look like and then how are you coding them racially or ethnically by looking at them. It's what do they sound like? It all, as you made a really brilliant point there. It all goes together and then becomes the sort of gestalt of how you look at the person, which, of course, if you're not self-aware, is going to be sort of a projection of your unprocessed enculturation, essentially.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. So how have you seen this then impact folks who work at a company that are, so they're a non-native English speaker? Have you still seen English language privilege show up when they work at a company that is based in their own country?
Yes, I have. Especially, and I will say it shows up in one of two ways. It will show up if it's an international company that that has English as sort of their transnational language. Within the office in region, they may be using, the common community language. But the moment they interact with any of their colleagues who are outside of the region, then they're expected to interact in English. But because of that, what will often happen is, and there are a variety of societal and cultural factors sort of, outside of the workplace that'll feed into this. But what will happen is that their English proficiency, even among their linguistic peers, will be seen as a kind of, will code as a shorthand for general level of education, general level of competence. And you'll see this, very strongly in places that are former colonies of, in the case of English, former colonies of the British Empire, where English is used as a marker of status in a way. And so if you don't, the person next to you speaks better English than you do, even though you never have cause to speak English with each other, you're always speaking Mandarin or Tamil or whatever. But if you know that when the time comes to talk to the office that's in, I don't know, Beverly Hills, that you aren't going to be able to speak English as comfortably as that person, then that can have an impact on your perception of your own competence sometimes. So I see it in that way. I see it also, I said two, but I'm really thinking of more as I say it. What I also see is I will have clients that need a DEI solution. Maybe they need a DEI plan drawn up or something like that, right? I'll take a piece of work like that. I'm working on the plan. I'm getting information about the company. They say, okay, we have offices in the US, in Poland, in Romania, and in India, right? And we need a DEI plan. And, can you also maybe design a couple of the learning offerings that are going to be in there? Okay, cool. Then I'll ask, okay, so when are these offerings going to be translated into Polish, Romanian, Hindi, Tamil, Gujarati, whatever? And the look I'll get oftentimes is, oh, everybody speaks English at the company anyway. And I'm like, okay, what you've just said at this point is basically we need to do this work on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. These are very culturally, regionally, and historically sensitive concepts, but we're going to design it all in one country, and then we're going to export it wholesale to another country, not even bother to put it in the language of that country. And these are challenging, difficult concepts to take on board, even in your native language. And we're going to make people do it in their second or maybe third or fourth language, and without any consideration of their linguistic or cultural, historic, or societal background. And then those employees are then held to account for taking on this material. And, it could be DI, but it could be other material as well, right? And they're held accountable for their learning outcomes for a complex subject in a non-native language that may not even be presented in a way that's culturally responsive. So there's that. So it can actually have a negative impact on their career progression, right?
For sure.
And then I also see it in situations where and this isn't so much about the workplace, but it's where societal things come into play. The chief example I have in my mind is this. Probably last year sometime, I was at the post office with my mother-in-law, and there was a poster in the post office, and it said something about, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it said something about web mail or web printing or web shipping services, I think it was. The rest of it was all in Greek, naturally, but it said web shipping services. And my mother-in-law doesn't speak English. So she asked me, she's like, what is that? I don't know what this is. Can you explain it to me? And I explained it to her. She was fine then. But it really put me in mind of something. Here is a person in their own country, right? Speaking completely fluent, obviously, in the indigenous language and community language of their country. And yet they are subtly being told that they need to learn the prestige language in order even to interact with some of the basic services of the country, right? So it's something that we see happening in the workplace, but we see it the way and the fact of it happening in the workplace is informed by these societal factors.
For sure.
And in turn, there's a sort of feedback loop that happens, because as English speaking workplaces, especially the larger names, right, become more prominent and have a larger global footprint, then more of society tries to sort of accord itself to the needs of those companies, with the idea that it improves the potential career options of that community, right? And it's with some justice that they think that, but that situation has been created entirely to the benefit of people who have English as their first language. So, and it's not something that people who have English as their first language really come across much in English speaking countries. Unless you are in a particular cultural enclave, you're at a store where everything's in Spanish or Ukrainian or something like that. For the most part, all the government services, everything it's in your language, and you don't have to worry about it, right? And we don't realize that is a privilege. Actually, that isn't afforded to everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate what you're saying about the workplace trainings. Tell us more about that side of like the cultural competency skills, because of course there's language, but tied just as much into language are just the cultural behaviors and mannerisms and shortcuts of thinking and just all the things that is culture. How does that play out for non-native English speakers who then also culturally are not from a like predominantly English speaking culture?
It, in my experience, it can often be a deal breaker. And I don't want to be overly dramatic about it, but I have had people in sessions that, maybe I didn't design myself, but I was facilitating the material. And people tell me, I don't know what to do with this. This does not speak to my reality. And so I'm not sure how to take this on board. And what it does is, one, it makes people feel like, I think the simplest way to say it is, it makes people feel like you created the material and you clearly were not even thinking about them when you did it.
Yeah.
It also can make people feel like, wow, I don't really understand this because it doesn't obtain to my lived experience, but maybe there's, everybody else seems to understand it. So what's wrong with me? Why don't, maybe I don't understand it. Well, I have seen people who are from different cultural backgrounds and different linguistic backgrounds doing a pretty Western centric English only DEI training and say, I feel bad that I don't understand this, and apologize for their lack of understanding. I'm like, no. That is not your fault. Let's take several steps back. That is not your fault at all. We need to break this down and make it appropriate for your particular situation. And an example I can give of how we need to make sure we have a cultural fit when we're doing these things is this. So if I'm talking about racism in the US context, we all pretty much know what we mean, right? If we're all, steeped in a US context, right? We know that we're talking about the genocide of the indigenous people. We know we're talking about chattel slavery. We know we're talking about Jim Crow. We know we're talking about Islamophobia post 9/11 and pre as well, because let's not pretend it just came about in the US with 9/11.
Thank you for that.
That is something that I have a real issue with, people pretending like Islamophobia just became a thing in the US in 2001. No, it didn't. I grew up in a neighborhood with people who were mostly from Iran and other places in the Middle East, and I saw some of the things they went through, and that was quite a bit before 2001. So I'm not that young. So it's very frustrating when people want to pretend that that's a new thing.
Thank you.
But it's So, if I'm talking about racism in the U.S. context, and we're all sort of familiar with and steeped in that context, we know what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
When we use the word racism here in Greece, we're oftentimes talking about discrimination kind of writ large, oftentimes
Mm.
against Roma people
Mm.
or
Mm.
against Albanian people, who form the largest
Mm.
non-Greek ethnic group here in
Mm.
Greece. Now, Albanians, from a US perspective, Albanians racially are no different from Greek people, right?
Mm. Mm.
But discrimination against Albanian people, which is distressingly prevalent, getting better, but still prevalent,
Mm.
is called racism here, right? And
Mm.
it wouldn't code as racism in the US. It'd be more about discrimination based on national origin or
Mm.
something like that. So if I were to take the US understanding and just put it on Greece and say, okay, when
Mm.
we talk about racism, we're talking about mostly anti-black prejudice. We're talking about that history of it. It doesn't make
Mm.
sense,
Mm.
and nobody would be able, or very few people would be able to really get their hands around it mentally, get their arms
Yeah.
around it, because it doesn't apply. I'm not speaking to their reality
Yeah.
anymore. um the same thing if I'm talking to a group of people from India, right?
Mm.
And of course then I have to, which part of India, which region of India, because there are
Because
those.
it's a huge country.
Exactly. It's a huge country, a billion people. Lots of regional differences. I believe it's 22,
Mm.
yeah, 22 scheduled languages in the Constitution. There are massive differences there that you need to be sensitive to. But if I'm
Mm.
speaking to people in India and I know all about, again, slavery and Jim Crow and Medgar Evers and Rosa Parks and all that,
Yeah.
cool. But if I don't know anything about Jawaharlal Nehru, or if I
Mm.
don't know anything about partition, or if I don't know anything about the British Raj, then I'm not
Mm.
talking to those people. I am not
Mm.
serving their needs, right?
Mm.
I'm almost, and I know this sounds overblown to say it, but it's almost a form of recolonization. Except at this time,
Mm.
it's not at the point of a gun, it's just with an ontological framework.
Yeah.
And so it's very frustrating. And what happens as a result, if it's not caught and corrected, is you have people coming away from these DEI trainings thinking either, wow, what's wrong with me that I didn't get it? Or
Mm.
that wasn't really useful for me.
Mm.
Or this is where it can get into even worse territory. Or this DEI stuff is kind of a load of crap because they
Yeah.
didn't, and we
Yeah.
open ourselves up to it when we do that. Because
And
if
that's
we
a
are,
completely fair reaction for someone
it
to
is,
have.
it
Truly.
is, it's a 100% fair reaction. If somebody preaching inclusion comes up to you and hasn't even bothered to include your cultural perspective, why should you listen to them?
Yeah.
I wouldn't. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't expect anybody else to.
Yep.
So it's, that's where it can go. And it also gives bad faith actors more ammunition than we should be giving them. I
Mm.
was in Paris with my family over the Christmas holidays, and I was getting some books from books. I hadn't been in Paris since I went to school, so a long time
Mm.
ago. I was getting some books, and I was just kind of browsing, and I saw all these books about the dangers of le wokisme. And one thing I've
Can you
noticed, because
translate that?
yes, absolutely, wokeism is what
Okay,
they're.
I thought
Yeah,
that might be
yeah.
what it
No,
was,
you're
but
right.
I
Yeah,
just want to
sorry.
make I just want to make sure. Okay,
I
okay,
should have.
okay.
Um, about the dangers of wokeism and
Woke.
what a
Define
certain
woke.
black. The
Keep going, keep going.
best way, by the way, the best way I've learned to get somebody who will not stop talking about how much they hate wokeism to stop talking is to ask them what woke is, to actually ask them to define it,
Yeah.
and then they're like, uh, because here's the thing: if you're really going to define it, be like, well, it's accepting
Caring
that
about people's
you're caring about
experiences of discrimination. Like, how
caring
dare
about
you?
people's experiences and understanding that
Yeah.
discrimination has certain historical and societal and systemic structures and effects that still impact
Ridiculous.
people to this day. Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's like, she says, when people call me woke, I say thank you now. And I'm at that point. I'm like, I try to be. I don't
Like,
always
are you
succeed, but I
saying
try.
you're asleep? What is, yeah. Like,
Exactly.
okay,
Like,
weird
yeah, right.
flex.
Go back to bed, I guess.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
But what certain reactionary elements in France have been able to do
Mm,
based on the history and trajectory of these issues in France, because when we're talking about France, we're dealing with a country that has a brutal colonial past in Northern Africa, a fairly recently ended brutal colonial past in
mm,
Northern Africa, and has a massive problem with Islamophobia that it likes to pretend is about protecting secularism. It's nothing of the sort. And so some elements have been able to position wokeism as this foreign influence that has
yeah.
nothing to do with France, has nothing to do with French culture, nothing to do with French society.
Mm, mm, mm.
Here's the thing: colorism, racism, Islamophobia, anti Semitism, these are massive
Yeah,
problems in France that
yeah,
absolutely need to be talked about. And squaring the tensions of the sort of French universalist ideal with the reality of gross inequity
yeah,
is not an easy thing, and it's not a comfortable thing for a lot of people to talk about. So when you can position this dialogue, this discourse, as something that was just sort of exported, or I'm sorry,
yeah,
imported from abroad, that doesn't
yeah,
have any real purchase in your culture,
yeah,
then it just enables people to just write it off wholesale.
yeah.
And then and then what are we doing even,
Would you say, I something just popped into my head that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Would you say that also because of, so anyone who knows me or talks to me for any length of time, which is showing up now, TikTok is like 80% of my personality at this point. That's another subject. But I one of the reasons I really love TikTok is learning from so many other people's lived experiences,
Mhm,
especially across time and space, that
mhm,
I
mhm.
might very well never interact in real life in person.
Right.
And so one of the things that I have seen a lot of Americans who travel to Europe express to, share with Americans back home. I'm American, so that's like very
Mhm,
much my context. We're analyzing in this conversation and kind of trying to decenter the US
mhm,
American perspective, and also the fact like that I am American,
mhm,
you're American,
mhm,
like that's part of the conversation for us to do. Is that so Europeans, I'm hearing in general, but very much including French folks, because there are so many negative stereotypes and like really deep seated negative thoughts about Americans, not being intelligent, uh,
mhm,
not, being very loud and brash, and like just a lot of negative, like unclassy, if you will, kind of
mhm,
qualities. Um, and now with a lot of the political issues that the United States is facing that are getting attention internationally, especially around our school shootings issues. There are a lot of
mhm,
folks in other countries who are looking at, and rightly so, honestly, with horror at all of the school
mhm,
shootings and shootings in general that happen in the United States, and thinking that because we're a democracy, in theory,
mhm.
that
Yeah.
we're actively choosing politicians or choosing
Mhm,
policies that allow this to continue happening without challenging
mhm,
it, all of these things,
mhm,
that there's this perception, especially in Europe, since you're mentioning European countries,
mhm,
but abroad, that Americans have all these negative qualities that then that layers on that if diversity, equity, and inclusion, wokeism, whatever, racism, whatever
mhm.
like topics we're talking about is coming from the United States, that then those stereotypes on top of that kind of further undermines any possible legitimacy. Would you say that
Mhm.
that is something you've seen?
I think, the way that it's really interesting that you're saying that, and I totally, totally hear that, and I've seen bits of that, to be honest,
Mm,
definitely. Um, I one thing that stands out to me sort of in thinking about this and thinking about how it plays out is, one, you made mention of it, and I think it's a really brilliant and important point. When you spend a lot of time priding yourself for living in a democracy, what you're saying without realizing it is, for the various social ills that your country may have, or political ills, let's call them that your country may have, the buck stops with you. You can't be in a democratic society when you want to talk about freedom and when you want to talk about your rights to do this and that. But then when you're talking about the political ills that your country has, say, oh, that has nothing to do with me, right? It does have something to do. Now, that is a different thing than saying it is your fault, because of course you can vote for something and have that thing rejected, or vice versa, right? Like you can participate in the democratic process, and that is no guarantee that your will is going to be done by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, and Americans know, like, we have the Electoral College and gerrymandering and all these things that, like, but all these non-American people, wherever they are in the world, European or non-European, they don't have that understanding of all these, like, horrible, corrupt ways that politicians and lobbyists and stuff like that have gone around the American people's voices and what they actually want. So anyway, sorry, like, this is like the only time that I feel a calling to defend the United States, which is so, like, normally I'm like, oh, the US does this and this and this is horrible, and I'm not going to celebrate July 4th because why would I? Juneteenth all the way, like, all the things like that's usually, but then the second other, anyway, I'm going to stop.
No, I hear you absolutely, and I mean, that instinct to sort of to castigate or to speak forthrightly and truthfully on the ills of the in group, but then to want to defend almost when it comes from the out group, that's very natural, right? That's just sort of a human thing.
I can talk bad about, this is an example, sorry, really quick. This is an example I give all the time of when I talk about, like, Muslim community issues, and because in my own work I talk about, like, Muslim inclusion, religious inclusion, DEI work, and talking about, like, the differences between what external members to in this case a religious community, Muslims being my lived experience, Muslims ourselves can have certain conversations, things we say about each other, critiques that we have internally, but then, like, someone else wants to. I have one sibling, I have a younger sister, and she and I fought all the time growing up, like cats and dogs fighting. But I had a friend in middle school who one time said something bad and critiqued or whatever, said something, we were 12, whatever, said something bad about my sister. And I, like, felt like I was going to rip her head off, my friend, because even though, and my friends saw me fight with my sibling all the time, but it's like, whoa. I can say whatever I want, but not you. Anyway, keep
100%. No, that's completely natural. That is completely natural. And the fact of the matter is that, people who don't live in the US don't have access to that information. They don't have access to that background, or at least not easy access to that background story. And I personally think, as Americans writ large, as a community, I think we would do ourselves a lot more favors if we were a little bit more externally honest about how things actually run in the US, and be like, yeah, it's a democracy, but with a major asterisk. Because let's talk about the electoral, like you said, let's talk about the Electoral College. Let's talk about gerrymandering. Let's talk about redlining. There's all of these.
Corporations are people.
Right. Like, there's all of these, like, your mileage may vary things that come under there. So, I think that is something really to keep in mind. But I do see this. There is this way in which some places, and I've heard this from people outside the US, there is this way in which some people see the way, and it's not post 2016. It's really not. 2016 was a symptom, not a cause.
What are you referring to?
Maybe something that happened in November in 2016 in the US. Oh, mercy.
Yeah.
There is a almost intractability to the
Mm,
discourse around diversity, equity, inclusion, especially as it relates to race in the United States, which makes a lot of sense
mm,
because that's building on the history of hundreds of years
mm.
of genocide of the indigenous people and chattel slavery, and then a whole civil war, and then Reconstruction that kind of got interrupted because Reconstruction was working a little too well for the people in
Yeah.
power. And then Jim Crow, and then all of that, right? And the incredibly complex, nuanced, and well, let me say it like this: the incredibly complex and nuanced dialogue or discourse
Mm,
around race in the United States and diversity, equity, and inclusion, therefore,
mm,
in the United States, combined with the fact that some of that complexity is a product of the the non-marginalized, the privileged
mm, mm.
classes, we'll call it that, making sure that the discourse never progresses too
Yeah.
far because it would go
Yeah.
places that are not in their favor.
Mm, mm.
If you look at that from the outside, you think, God, I don't want this. You know what I mean? You think,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want this to be part of my national dialogue, part of my cultural dialogue,
Mm, mm,
part
mm,
of the societal discourse that I'm
mm.
having, right? And so there can be this kind of feeling like that's y'all,
Yeah.
that's not us. And it's so there is this sort of sense of not necessarily the impression of Americans as a whole, but the impression of how intractable the discourse around DEIJ has
Mm,
seemed in the U.S. context. That
mm.
when people look at it look at it externally, they tend to shy away from it.
Yeah.
Especially again if it's presented as what DEIJ is, right?
Yeah.
As if the U.S. version was the only
Yeah.
version of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel that I see some level for DEI practitioners, if we can critique our own for a moment,
We should critique our own. Let's
that
critique our own.
there is this sometimes gaslighting of if someone from a non North American, non US cultural context might express that the trainings, the content, the learnings that they're receiving don't fit within their cultural context, which is completely valid feedback, that some DI practitioners might react very unconstructively with saying, well, you then are the problem because you are hiding the isms of your system, or you have internalized
Mhm,
racism, or you internalized colorism, or internalized
mhm,
isms of some sort, like turning it on them when they're like, no, this, like, nothing that you're saying has any level of cultural competency with the culture of the people that you're talking to, the
mhm,
offices that are not in the West. You as a DI practitioner have not done the work, and especially as well, like we're talking about English language privilege as well. So there's the language aspect, there's the cultural competencies, like how different isms of the world show up in different ways, and the practitioner who's responsible for catering that to their learners, not the
mhm.
learners to like do somersaults on top of whatever their actual job is, right? Like they're not
Thank
DI
you.
practitioners. They're not learning the history of every other country so that they can know
Mhm.
all the cultural competencies of that country so that the DI practitioner then doesn't need to get to know that. Like that's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
And then the DI practitioner, if they react in this unconstructive, really gaslighting kind of way, or like, oh, you, the learner, are the problem because you have internalized isms, whatever the ism is,
Mhm.
that shows why you can't accept or learn from what I, the DI practitioner, am saying to you. Even like, it's just so messed up.
Oh, it's incredibly messed up, and I will go even farther because I am a firm believer that if we are doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and we only turn a critical lens onto oppressive systems and oppressive structures that we want to talk about, but we don't turn a critical lens on our own practices and how we might have internalized some of those structures and practices, or maybe playing into them, albeit unknowingly, but still, then we're not really doing the work. We're telling other people to do the work. We are not doing the work. So I think it is, frankly, I'll say it like this. I think it is our moral duty to be critical of our own practices and to apply a critical lens to our practices. I feel that very, very strongly, actually. And I have seen, to your point, precisely, I have seen DEIJ practitioners get kind of salty with people for how they reacted to a particular offering, or for not taking them up on a particular offering or whatever. And I would ask afterward, I'd be like, okay, did you offer it in their language? Well, no, it was in English. Okay. The problem one.
You don't think anything is wrong with that? Nothing occurs to you.
Sometimes I'll wait, like, okay.
Yeah. But that's the whole point of privilege. The whole idea is just so invisible and unknown. It's just the standard. It's not even a spoken explicit understanding. It's so just invisible in the air that we breathe.
Exactly. That's what privilege, that's how, like, one thing I really work on with people is talking to them about privilege and marginalization, how they do this complex dance, and how the same person can be both privileged and marginalized depending on which part of their identity is being focused on.
Most people are.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I have a very visible marginalized identity in most parts of the world, but I also have massive amounts of privilege in other ways, right? I am a man. I am cisgendered. I am heterosexual. I am not disabled. And I live in a world that has been made incredibly easy for people of those four categories. So I am marginalized and privileged at the same time. And depending on where and when and how I'm walking through the world, one of those identities is going to show up more than the other. But I will see DEIJ practitioners, putting an offering out there. It's not in language. It doesn't seem to be tailored at all to the cultural or societal or historical realities of the people that they're working with. And they'll feel like you said, it's their fault. They don't want to, they don't want to do the work. They don't want to look inside. Yeah. They don't want to unpack their different isms. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do that.
How convenient.
They probably don't. Nobody really does. Even when we're working within a cultural and linguistic context that we know very well, we always get resistance. Doing this work is not about everybody loving you and making lots of friends, right? So of course you're going to get that. You can't use that as an excuse. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, you are giving them every reason to reject what you're offering.
Yeah.
And why would you know that people are going to have resistance to these issues anyway? Why would you make it so easy for them to reject it? And frankly, I can't blame them for rejecting it.
Yeah.
Because you've just shown that you don't really care. We bang on and on about lived experience, but you're showing them that you don't really care about their lived experience when you present it that way to them.
Yeah.
I don't care what your
not to speak directly to, something that in theory, like any qualified, any DEI practitioner worth anything should have down pat, is the difference between equality and equity. And literally, how does this apply to language and cultural competency?
Thank you.
This whole conversation is about trying to treat everyone equally.
Precisely.
I'm going to have one thing in one way, and I'm going to provide it to everyone exactly the same. And they're the problem if they can't make it work.
There we go.
But people are inherently different. Diversity. People are diverse, including language, proficiencies, what native language they have, cultural all of that. Anyway, just like, I know it's funny. I even see non-DI practitioners talk about like, oh, will you stop talking about the equality equity thing? Is so many, but it's like, just everything comes, so much comes back to that.
Exactly. We'll stop talking about it when it stops being a thing. Like, really? Seriously.
Yeah.
No, and I think, just to sort of give my origin story about it,
Ooh.
is I think where it came from was this. I was, for quite a long time, I was the coordinator for a study abroad program for students from Japan. And I had other roles sort of concurrent to that. I was teaching, etc. But that was one of my main duties. And I remember that we had been talking to the students had done a lesson. They were taking like an American history course, basically. And they had done a lesson, I believe it was when they did the Civil War lesson, although it might have been the Civil Rights Movement. I don't remember. Now, I had the position I did in that department basically because there was nobody else in that department who spoke Japanese, nobody else who could operate in that linguistic and social cultural context. So they needed somebody, because oftentimes the students came with pretty low proficiency.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, makes sense, right? And I remember there were a group of students came into my office and they're like, Michael, we are really confused by this lesson that we've learned. And it just, I think I understand it, but I don't know if I understand it. So I said, you know what? All y'all come in. We're going to replay the last 30 minutes of class, but we're going to do it in Japanese. And I'm going to give you examples that make sense for things you know about. And we did it. And one of the students came up to me afterward and said, I feel like I finally understand this for the first time. And I'm like, whoa. How many people are taking classes like this, going to trainings like this, taking workshops like this, and they walk out feeling like, I feel like I get it, but I'm not sure. And then feeling all those feelings about not being sure about if they get it or not. When what we could be doing, if we were paying attention, is speaking to them metaphorically and literally in their language, from their context, with consciousness of their background, and breaking it down for them in a way that made sense to them. And then they walk away going, now I understand it. Now I see why this is important. Now I see why America went through what it did. Now I see how this works in Japan. And I'm going to know to look out for its manifestations in Japan. Because if I'm going to Japan and I'm looking out for anti-Black racism all over the place, I'm sorry, there's not enough of us in Japan to have that much of a. And I'm not saying anti-Black racism doesn't exist in Japan, but what I'm saying is that in terms of being this really pervasive and pernicious societal thing, there's just simply not the population there for that. However, if we are talking about the former, in the old system, the lower class or lower caste people, or if we're talking about people of ethnic Korean or ethnic Chinese descent who were brought over as indentured servants during the time of the Japanese Empire in the early 20th century. Now, that's where we really need to talk about some diversity and inclusion and equity stuff, because that's a very live issue for Japan, right? So break it down like that, and I'm going to find lots of opportunities to operationalize these lessons about diversity that I've been learning. But if I'm just focusing on what happened to Ruby Bridges, as important as that is, and as crucial as that is from the American perspective, and it is absolutely, and more people should learn about it in the US, I'm not speaking to the Japanese reality, right? So,
this is all so important. To start getting us to a conclusion, what would you recommend to any DI practitioners listening in, anyone? And also, I like to open this kind of stuff to like DI minded folks, right? For anyone listening, you don't have to just have DEI or DNI or EDI or whatever your acronyms, justice, accessibility, whatever your acronyms are that you prefer. I just use DEI. You don't have to have that in your job title at all. So anyone who is on board and supportive and wants to advocate for diversity and equity and inclusion and accessibility and justice and in their spaces, workplaces, universities, schools, religious house of worship, what have you.
Uh-huh.
So what would you recommend for these folks around improving, decentering
Uh-huh.
English language privilege, and
Uh-huh.
also, tying that in, of course, as we've seen, to the cultural competency skills that are so intermeshed with that?
I would say there are a few things, and I say this with full realization that there are other things that could be done that I'm just not thinking of at the moment.
Mm-mm.
Um, so this is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list or even an overly prescriptive list.
Mm-mm.
But these would be some of my suggestions. One, and this is going to probably go over like a lead balloon with a lot of people, learn another language. And I can hear people
Yeah.
already saying, but it takes a lot of time. It's really hard. Da, da, da. And I always want to say, in fact, I have said, do you think it was easy or quick for the people that learned English so that they could come to your workshop? Probably not. So maybe if you want to work in these populations, you
Mm.
should be functional enough in the language to do it. And if that means that until you get to that point, you don't get to work in those populations, okay. You are not entitled to
Yeah.
access to every cultural and linguistic population, regardless of whatever your background or effort to learn might be.
Yep.
You don't get the keys handed to you because you have that dark blue US passport and you can say, hi, how you doing? And you've been saying it since you were 3 years old,
Yep.
right? It doesn't come with that. You have to earn it. And I really think sometimes some more Western slash US DEI practitioners, without even realizing, operate from a certain sense of entitlement. And they think they should have access to these
Yeah.
spaces that really not necessarily. And the fact of the matter is, you have to understand that there will always be a communicative and epistemological differential between you and the people that you're working with if you
Mm.
can't meet them where they are linguistically and culturally. So
Mm.
that's one thing that I would
Mm.
say. Um, the other thing is work on really deeply developing your knowledge of other cultures, histories, societies, especially the ones that you find yourself in contact with a
Mm.
lot. If you have, I guess this is the way to say it. There's that saying that, the danger of a single story.
Yeah.
And that idea that stereotypes aren't dangerous or aren't bad because they're false necessarily, is because they're incomplete.
Mm.
If you
Mm.
only
Mm.
know the US version of diversity and inclusion, that's all you know. It's wildly incomplete, and you need to be
Mm.
very conscious of that and have the humility to understand that,
Yes.
right? The teachings of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, as much as I love them, I literally reread Letter from Birmingham Jail every year. I love it
Yeah.
that much. But those teachings are not a skeleton key to diversity and inclusion
Yeah.
issues the world over. Other things are happening in their own context. Learn
Mm.
about
Mm.
their context. Another thing I would say, and I sort of hinted at this earlier,
Mm.
is and hopefully with what I just said, with that would come the realization that diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, etc., are talked about, are lived and talked about and presented differently in different languages and
Mm.
cultures, right? To the extent that even when we talk about, race versus ethnicity, in some languages those are sort of all collapsed into one word,
Mm.
right?
Mm. Mm.
And so we need to paraphrasistically detangle those threads and say, okay, when I'm talking about race, this is what I mean. When I'm talking about ethnicity, this
Mm.
is what I mean, whatever. Um, and another thing, and again, I sort of teased it a moment ago, but an understanding that not everything is for you. And I'm using the general you. In
Yeah.
other words, there may come a point of somebody says, hey, would you like to do this workshop? Would you like to present this training? Would you? And you will look at it and say, I'm not the best person for that. There is somebody else who knows more about this community, who knows more about, who can do it in the proper language, who
Mm.
should do it, and not me. It means sometimes walking away from a job because you realize you are not the best person
Yeah.
to do it. And it's ironic. I feel like almost sometimes I'm watching that SNL skit from a few years ago where they had a bunch of people who were listening to Beyonce's album, is the Lemonade album,
Mm-mm.
and it was one of the first albums that she was pretty overt with black consciousness, we'll call it, in her presentation and the style of music and everything. And there were some bangers that came off of that album, by the way. But there was that SNL skit where people were listening to it and they're like, why does Beyonce sound this way? She sounds black. Maybe she is black, you know, and
Oh boy.
I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot to dig into there about how, yes, Beyonce's been seen as a symbol of beauty, but she's also very fair skinned and does have some fairly Eurocentric features and lightens her hair, and there's all these things, right? But there was this one scene in the skit which I love, where somebody's listening to it and saying, or this group of people are listening to it, and one person says, like, I don't understand it. I just don't get it at all. And another person says, well, maybe it's not for us. And another person says, but everything usually is. And I feel that way sometimes
Yeah.
with some people in our sector. They feel like, well, everything usually is for us.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, working in DEIJ does not immunize you from that sort of cultural chauvinism.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but it can be so deep-seated and well, it's doing what privilege does, isn't it?
Yeah.
The
That's
best
what I'm
privilege
hoping
is
is that,
invisible to the privileged.
yeah, that's what
And
I'm hoping is the folks that are listening to this, again, with the intention being that this is reaching DEI minded, DEI practitioners and people, that just like we've heard the difference between equality and equity probably a million times by now, that then this conversation slots nicely into that understanding. The same way is that usually we have talked about white privilege already, hopefully by now, many times. And we've brought that up to other people, whether we ourselves are racially white or, ethnically mixed European of some sort of ancestry, or you're a person of color. Whatever the case may be, you have addressed as a part of DEI work, justice work, white privilege. This slots into exactly what we would normally have as our talking points for talking to white folks about their own white privilege. Everything you're saying about not even realizing that you feel that everything is for you, there isn't even a concept to have it occur to you that, oh, this doesn't make sense with my lived experience or my way of living or my community's way of being or country or English language culture of like multiple countries who speak predominantly English. This, what I'm receiving, the feedback I'm receiving, the content, the lesson, whatever, is not in a way that makes sense for me. It doesn't even occur to us because we're so deeply ingrained with just English speaking, Western culture, values, what have you, as the norm, the air that we breathe, that it doesn't even occur to us that maybe it's just not for us. Maybe it's really just that simple. And so for those of us who are DI minded, if we've explained white privilege and we've seen the reactions, negative or struggling at least with trying to understand something, which makes sense that it's hard to understand when you first hear about it. You're a fish trying to have someone explain the ocean to you. All these things, all these metaphors that we ourselves have used to explain to other people, this is literally now we're applying it to ourselves about English language privilege, about United States or Western privilege, when working with companies that have international offices or just completely other cultures, on and on and on. So I'm hoping that for all of you listening, you're seeing the parallels here. Just as Michael, you mentioned, we have different areas of marginalization and privilege, and depending on the context, something that is a privilege in one space can very easily become an area of marginalization in a completely different or even slightly different context.
100%. 100%. And I think, you know, it's I hope, because I'm really accustomed to saying things that are not terribly comfortable for my fellow DEIJ practitioners to hear. But I do hope that it is heard, especially, and I think you crystallized it perfectly, actually, just now. We're still talking about privilege.
Yeah.
Replace white with English. We're still talking about privilege, right? We're still talking about systems that invisibilize that privilege so that the privileged don't resist against it either, because they just feel like it's the way the world works.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's
They don't
someone
even
else, there's something is wrong with the other person because they don't get it or they're fighting it or
There we
whatever.
go.
Because it's so easy for you. I understand it. So therefore everyone understands it. And
Exactly.
they're the ones with the problem.
What precisely. And I think there's something that's under there, and it's even less pleasant, I think, to look at, but look at it we must, because again, as you and I both know, and as all people who do work in this field know, this work isn't about being comfortable. It's about finding, exploring, and working with the truth, right? We often reveal the systems of injustice that we are okay with by how we talk about them. And what I mean by that is this. I have never heard in this field, and even, from most socially justice-minded people, I have never heard somebody say, well, yeah, being white is definitely a privilege in the workplace, but that's just kind of the way it is. Or being a man is definitely a privilege, but that's just sort of the way it is. Or, really only Christian holidays are recognized by most employee leave policies, but what are you going to do? That's just sort of the way it is, right? We don't throw our hands up there. We don't abdicate our responsibility. We don't cede all of that power. We say, no, it is the way it is, and that is why we're doing the job we do. We want to change that. But when it comes to language, all of a sudden, well, English is the language of international business. So, so much has gone into teaching people English now at this point. Wait a second. So all of this other injustice, we fight against it every day. We fight against it. That's our literal job. We spend our time and our energy and our money learning about these things so that we can dismantle these systems. But then we point to this unjust system that happens to benefit us. Can't do anything about that. It's just, it's unfortunate, but it's the way things are. An attitude that we would never accept about any of the other injustices.
We would all be like, what?
Exactly.
All freaking out if it were about something else.
We'd be flipping over tables. But it comes to English and it's like, oh, well, no, I don't think so. I just, that is a kind of moral abdication that I cannot, I can't see my way around that. And it's not just because it disadvantages people that I'm close to, right? Or people that I've grown up with or whatever who don't speak English. It's because it's just manifestly unfair.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it is setting the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice back. Because there are people who are getting these trainings, who are going to these workshops, who are taking advantage of these learning opportunities, not really being able to apply it in a way that's comfortable or natural for them, walking away from it with maybe half understanding at best, or at worst completely turned off to it, and thinking, okay, this is a bunch of nonsense. I don't want anything to do with this. And then where are we? We are actively working against the interests of what we're supposed to be working toward, right? Which is a world.
In many ways, it's very hypocritical.
It's incredibly hypocritical. It is massively
Yeah.
hypocritical. It is,
And
and it's very distressing.
no, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Oh, God.
I'm just thinking of
I'm really proud I haven't interrupted you more during this conversation because I have a huge problem. Again, ADHD. Anyone with ADHD knows, but I'm very proud of myself. Good job, Rahimeh. No interrupting this time. But anyway, of course, at the last second. But it's just a lot of what you're sharing here right now in this part of the conversation is hitting. I don't specialize in accessibility. I'm not a disability, specific DEI practitioner. However, of course, I try very hard to also learn not just about, disability, but other areas of DEI that I don't specialize in, so that I can know who to refer out to know where my expertise ends and where someone else is the best person to take over that and refer people out and on and on and on, and weave in extra examples. So in this case, a lot of what you're saying around language, privilege, and areas of marginalization for me comes and hits a lot of the points that I've learned from accessibility DEI practitioners around disability. Not that speaking a language, not that that's not English, is a disability,
No,
but
I know what you're saying though.
kind of like
Yeah.
an accessibility, like it's literally not accessible.
Yeah.
And just like there are captions on videos that we expect the contrast of colors between images so that you can read the text on an image very easily because the contrast is enough. The fact that you're not putting, I don't know, music on top of other videos where someone is talking, so someone who is not able to distinguish between the music and what someone is saying. Again, I'm not an expert in disability or accessibility,
I
so
see what you're
I don't have too many more examples, but all the things that I have learned is just the same thing of it literally is not accessible information. And then you're testing people and holding people accountable for information that you have not made accessible to them, and then pointing the finger at them, which of course, again, then naturally either they're going to react at best with confusion and at worst be like all DI, all justice oriented work, wokeism, like literally the whole point of wokeism, right, is like, oh, this is all a bunch of hooey and made up, and people are just trying to pass off things that are not really justice oriented.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is it's just like you say, at best they're confused, at worst they come away from it antagonistic
Yeah.
to it. And it what it does is it it reinforces then this notion that DEIJ is a very, not just Western even, but US
Yeah.
centric thing,
Yeah.
and gives people more room to ignore it,
Yeah.
and also stifles the conversation within those regions.
Yeah.
To just give a really, really quick example at the end here,
Please. Yeah.
I remember watching, oh, this was several months ago, but I remember watching this interview it was a French talk show. It was when the elections were getting ready to happen in France, and it was an interview with, or a sort of a town hall meeting with Macron. And he had said at one point that France is not multicultural, which went over really well in some sectors and really poorly in others, because there are a lot of people in civil society that are doing DEIJ work in France. And so, there was a lot of people who were predictably very and justifiably very upset about it. And in his response, in his clarification, which I was like, okay, I see what you're saying. I think there are some good counter arguments to this, but I see where you're coming from. What he was trying to say is, I refuse to call France multicultural, because if I said that, then I would be saying that the Algerians, ethnic Algerians who are here, or people from Turkey, or whatever, who are now part of French society, that they are somehow separate from it, that they are not as French, essentially. It's this sort of French idea of universalism. We can all be French. Frenchness is open to everybody. Now, it elides a whole bunch of realities about unequal job opportunities, about just day-to-day discrimination, microaggressions and macroaggressions that happen in French society. It completely ignores the very big issue of Islamophobia in France. It ignores all of those things, but you have to meet people where they are. And the fact of the matter is, right now, discourse in French society is about that tension between universalism, which can be seen as an embracing of everybody, no matter what their background is, and multiculturalism, which some people will try to position as unnecessarily divisive and toxic to the French project. There's a discussion that can happen there, but you can't have that discussion through a US lens. It's just not going to happen. The history is different. The culture is different. The arguments that people will make against the points that you're trying to make are going to be different. And you have to be ready for that. And it's so, I always say, don't put a French solution on a Brazilian problem. That is my job, to make sure that we don't do that, right? Because each place is going to have its own history, its own culture, its own society, its own language, its own customs, and you have to address these issues. The universal part might be that issues of discrimination, diversity, inclusion, whatever, are happening in those places, but the way they're happening, the manifestation of them is going to be different, and you have to meet them where they are if you're going to be able to talk about them in a respectful and effective way.
Yeah, and if the point of our work, which I hope the point of our work is to create change, make the world a better place, ideally, then the change that we want to see in the result has to be ultimately the goal, and not they have to do it in the way that I am telling them to do it. Exactly. I'm sure that all of us in our interpersonal lives, no matter who we are, it has nothing to do with our profession or, if we're DEI minded or not. Anyone, even people who believe in wokeism. Everyone in our interpersonal lives has experienced someone telling us to do something, to fix something in our lives that doesn't work with our brain, or we don't like it for some reason, whatever the case may be, but they just continue to hammer us. Sometimes a lot of it's our parents, right? Oh, why don't you do it this? Do this, do this, do this, do this. And whereas you might appreciate the intention of what they're trying to help you with, and you do have a problem, but by them continuing to hammer on you, do it in this way, this is what's going to solve your problem, and you have various different reasons, whether it's just you feeling that it's not a comfortable way of going about doing things, or they don't understand something like actually kind of logistical about your life, and you're trying to explain it and they're just ignoring you and like, oh, that's not a big deal, but it really is a big deal to you. And they can, like, we've all, I think, is probably a pretty universal experience for someone in our life having done that to us. And this is just on a more systemic scale.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your lived experience, your professional expertise with all of us today. I'm so grateful for your time, especially, again, the time of night that it is for you in Greece. How can anyone listening in today find you, learn more about your work, hire you? Where do you want to point people to?
First, I want to say thank you for having me. I loved having this discussion. Earlier when you were saying, so to lead us to a conclusion, I'm like, I could go on about this for another 2 hours.
I know. Oh my God.
Easily. But
you don't have to go to bed, do you? Like, we can just
no. That's going to bed is that's for the week. No. So I really, really thank you for allowing me this opportunity, this platform. This has been a wonderful discussion. You've said some things that have really sparked some thoughts in me, and I want to kind of dig deeper into them. So this has been absolutely wonderful. People can find me, of course, on LinkedIn. You just look up my name, Michael Reid. My name is also in Greek on LinkedIn. So if you see Michael Reid with a Greek spelling of it in the middle, you've found me. You can also find me at my website, which is alif2omega.net. .com. .net was my old one. I started that website about 10 years ago, and originally it was a website for people to learn Arabic and Greek. I just was collecting free resources for people to learn because I wanted them to learn. I
Oh,
was
you
doing
bought
some,
it?
yeah, that's my
Oh,
domain.
that's so cool.
That is my domain. I started it because it was when the Syrian refugee crisis was really started 2014,
Yeah.
2015, really starting to gather steam. And I thought, okay, I speak Greek, I speak Syrian Arabic, not great, but I can get by. It'd be good to create a resource for people to learn these languages so that they can communicate with each other. So that's how it started. And it just kind of was there as this little
Yeah.
side thing that I did for years. But now I've have it as the language stuff in one section
Yeah.
and then the DEI stuff in another. So yes, aleph to omega.net. And uh, I will send you how to spell it. So it's
Yes, all the links for all of you listening, I will have all the links in the description below. So please do make sure to check that out. I have Michael's full bio. Please do check out his work. As you have heard today, so much expertise to offer to your organization, to your DI work. If you are a business owner yourself, please reach out to Michael for anything that we've discussed today. Michael, do you want to leave us with any last thoughts before I close us out?
My last thought would be, even if you have listened to this and you think he is wrong, he does not know what he's talking about, reach out to me then too. I would love to have a discussion about that, because maybe I am wrong about something. Maybe there's something I haven't thought of. Please call me out, correct me on it. Let's get into that discussion. We don't solve anything by refusing to talk about these issues. So, I want to hear from everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael, so much. Thank you all at home
Thank you.
for listening in. Be well, be safe, and I will see you on our next conversation.